In this lecture, we're going to start focusing on the creation of controlled vocabularies and how to create them. And this will be in two parts, and this first half is going to talk about some of the things you need to think about and approaches you might take when you need to create a controlled vocabulary. So there's a couple steps that you go through creating a controlled vocabulary. And this lecture is going to focus on the first half of these steps, the first few, specifically defining your domain, gathering your concepts, and selecting your approach. And the subsequent lecture is going to talk about the second half of the process. So the first thing you need to do is to define your domain. So you need to think about what is the scope, right? How many documents are going to be in this collection? How many resources am I going to need to describe? What are the characteristics of those resources? What's the space in which those resources live? You also want to think about from what perspective you're going to create this vocabulary. Are they experts, right? From an expert perspective, because you might use different terminology than, say, if you were coming from a novice perspective or an introductory perspective. There might be different disciplinary approaches or other perspectives that you might need to address. And then you want to think about who are the intended users. Is there a specific user group? Are they scholars? Are they students? Are they children? Because that's also going to affect many of the choices you make when you're creating a controlled vocabulary. Then you need to select your approach to your controlled vocabulary. You want to think about, before you create your vocabulary, some things you want to think about are whether or not it will be a pre or post coordinated vocabulary, an open or closed vocabulary, an enumerated or a synthesized vocabulary. We're going to talk about each of those in turn. So first, let's talk about the difference between pre and post coordination. So pre-coordination is this idea of combining multiple concepts into one term or one subject heading in anticipation of a search. Whereas post-coordination is combining single concept terms, so terms that only represent one idea or one concept, and those are combined at the time of searching through techniques like Boolean searching. These are usually combined by the user when they are formulating their search query. In pre-coordination, two or maybe more concepts are combined into a single term. And these concepts are combined already within the CV, the controlled vocabulary. You can think of pre-coordination as the pre meaning prior to search. So these concepts are wedded together before anyone conducts a search. They're already wedded together in the vocabulary and therefore the description of our resources. So first, often we'll see concepts joined with parts of speech like a conjunction or a preposition. So history of China, art projects for children, information systems in libraries. Sometimes multiple concepts are indicated by what are called subdivisions, and these may use punctuation or other symbols to bring these concepts together and to join them. So here's an example from Library of Congress subject headings, which uses dashes. So we have cats, diseases, United States. So anytime you see these flags, if you see prepositions being used within a term, or you see these dashes, it's usually an indicator that this subject heading or this term is pre-coordinated. It's brought together multiple ideas. But sometimes it's not that obvious, right? So here we have the example, homeless, non-feral cats. There's obviously multiple ideas happening in this term. It's representing multiple different topics combined together. The idea of homelessness, the idea of non-feralness, and the idea of cats. But there's no easy identifier, there's no dashes, there's no prepositions, but it is clearly a pre-coordinated term. In post-coordinate vocabularies, there's one concept per term. It doesn't mean one word per term, right? A single indexing term could be a phrase, like birthday cake. But we want to think here in terms of concepts. And we combine those concepts later. The user combines them at the search phase when they're formulating their query. So instead of having the full term shelters for cats, a post-coordinate vocabulary would have the term shelters and it would have the term cats, and the onus would be on the user or the searcher to search for those two terms together, perhaps using a Boolean search like and or. You can see here examples of multi-word terms that represent single concepts. Digital humanities has 2 words. That doesn't mean that digital humanities is a pre-coordinate term. That's one concept, right? When we think of the digital humanities, it's a single concept. The same with the university education. That's one concept in this vocabulary. But if we put those together, right, this is post-coordinate. The same here, information systems is one single concept. So it's a post-coordinate term. We could combine it with libraries. We could combine it with digital humanities. We could combine it with cats. I'm not sure why. But you can see here that the coordinating happens at the time of search. Here are some examples of the same concepts expressed in the 2 different ways, expressed in a post-coordinate way and a pre-coordinate way. So here we have, in our post-coordinate, we have concepts like animal nutrition, effects, and salt. If we had a pre-coordinate term that represented that, it might look something like the effects of salt on animal nutrition. We have post-coordinate terms, France, skilled personnel. So remember that that doesn't mean it's a pre-coordinate term. That's a post-coordinate term. Skilled personnel is a unique concept. The same with textile industries. Training. We might have an example, say from Library of Congress subject headings, that creates a pre-coordinate term, France-textile industries-skilled personnel-training. So combining all of those concepts into one single term. And the same with genetics, nutrition, and plants, where we can see separately post-coordinate individual terms versus pre-coordinate single term where these ideas have all been combined together, plants-nutrition-genetic aspects. Most pre-coordinate controlled vocabularies include both kinds of terms, both terms that cover a single concept and terms that cover multiple concepts. So, we might have the term cats in our vocabulary, but we might also have the term shelters for cats. We might have the term happiness in our vocabulary and the term shelters for cats, a pre-coordinate term, so a post-coordinate term, pre-coordinate term. That can then be combined in searching if you're looking for how happy cats are in shelters. But you want to look at sort of the proportion of terms if you're trying to determine what kind of vocabulary a CV is. If there's an abundance of these kinds of coordinate terms that have multiple concepts in them, then the character of that CV, we can call it a pre-coordinate CV. In a post-coordinate CV, it's the opposite. It's mostly single concept terms. It's pretty rare, though, for any controlled vocabulary to consist only of single concept terms. There's usually something going on in the vocabulary that needs to be represented in a pre-coordinate way. So again, it's not all or nothing, it's more or fewer. There's advantages and disadvantages to each of these types of vocabulary. Some advantages of pre-coordination are that all concepts that might apply to a single resource appear in a single term. So you don't have to apply multiple different terms to a particular document to represent all of the subjects or all of the topical coverage in that document. Pre-coordinate terms also have context and meaning embedded in the order of the terms. So they might make more sense to people looking at them, right? Think about the effects of salt on animals or genetic aspects of nutrition. They might make more sense to someone encountering them, and they might afford more precision when searching because of that. Using different syntax means that different concepts can be expressed using those same sort of simple ideas. So here we could have art by children, art for children, art about children, children in art, children in art, Whereas in a post-coordinate vocabulary that only had the terms children and art, we could search for them together, but we would retrieve all of these items, art by children, art for children, etc. We wouldn't be able to get at that nuanced difference of art created by children or art maybe created for children. And then results of a multiple concept search will give you a list of terms to select from. So instead of getting search results of items themselves, of resources themselves, a pre-coordinate vocabulary can be presented to a user in a list where you see the subject and understand the subject in context versus just jumping straight to the resources, which might be confusing. And so this lets people browse all the different subjects and the relationships between those subject terms to get an overview of what's available in the collection. So here's an example, right? If we're browsing our Library of Congress subject headings, this is from the libraries at the University of Washington. And if we search for children in art, that pre-coordinated term, we see here we don't get a list of books, we get a list of subjects. And we can see children in art catalogs, children in art exhibitions, children in art Great Britain exhibitions, and so on and so forth. So a user can really navigate this concept rather than immediately being taken to bibliographic records or representations of the resources themselves. If we click through, right, it told us there were a number of particular resources affiliated with that subject, with that controlled vocabulary term. If we click through, then we will get a list of those resources that all have the subject heading children in art applied to them. It's not without some disadvantages, right? If you have to represent all of these complex ideas in multiple coordinated terms, you're going to need more terms, right? Whereas before, we could have two terms, children and the term art. In our post-coordinate vocabulary, that's two, but we need children in art, one. Number two, children and art. Number three, art for children. Number four, art by children, so on and so forth. So you need more terms, and there's a lot of vocabulary bloat that can happen. You might need complex rules for combination. So you might, if your catalogers are creating these pre-coordinate terms when they're applying the vocabulary, they're going to need a lot of guidance on how that creation and that combination can happen. That makes your CV more expensive, that makes the need for training, for indexers, more necessary and possibly more expensive. And there's a higher possibility of error, that indexers might make errors when they are applying these terms to resources. Again, like I said, you can end up with a bulky CV with lots of bloat, and these long strings of terms, although a lot of times they can be clear to people and clearly expressing more nuanced concepts, but the longer they get, the less interpretable they really are to an end user. So what does it really mean to have the subject heading ethnic groups, young people, ethnic identity, psychotherapy, cultural aspects? You know, at that point, it can be really hard, especially for an end user, to understand. In our old manual systems, the only way you could access some of these subjects was by the first concept listed, right? They were in alphabetical order. So if you were looking for children in art and you looked under art, you're not going to find that access. It's not going to do a keyword search or search all of those characters. That's been improved in our digital environment, but it's still not as ideal as it could be. And then, you know, once you're sort of lumping concepts together to create these terms, where do you stop? How do you know when you have enough concepts included in your term, and how long is too long for a term? So let's shift to talking about our post-coordinate vocabularies and some advantages of those. So they're generally considered to be more flexible because the assumption is that users are going to do most of the work, and they can sort of mix and match, like Lego bricks, all of these different terms when they're formulating their queries. You don't have the same kind of vocabulary bloat because each concept is represented only once, and it's on the user to combine that concept with other concepts. That also means rules for creating terms can be simpler, So you don't need as much training, there's less room for error, it's easier to construct, it costs less money, it takes less time, perhaps, for people to implement. These shorter terms with only one concept in them might be more accessible and easier to read and understand, especially for end users. And if you're using some sort of manual system like an alphabetical list or a printed catalog, those individual concepts might be more accessible. They won't be buried within other concepts. There are some disadvantages, right? We talked about how it doesn't allow for those nuanced distinctions in meaning, right? The difference between art and children versus children in art versus art created by children. You might need to assign many multiple headings to a single resource to achieve, your coextensiveness or to cover all of the topics that are represented in that resource, which means there's a heavy reliance on searching mechanisms and how good your search algorithms are and how good your search systems are, because a lot of context can be lost. Results of these kinds of searches will not retrieve that post-coordinate list of subject headings like we saw in the University of Washington library example. We're going to jump pretty much straight to results list because we might be combining labels or subject headings that have been applied to multiple books and bringing them together. So these results really don't support a lot of collocation. They're not grouped according to similarity. They can often be listed in a random order. The quote-unquote black box of relevance that we've seen, but publication date, author's last name alphabetically, things like that. And so this kind of results list doesn't really give the user an overview of the subject area. It gives the user an overview of resources in the collection, but it doesn't help them navigate the subject per se. And go down that list and say, oh, children in art, I was really interested in Great Britain exhibitions. So looking at that subject list, I know that there's more narrow. You would just have to keep trying your searches over and over again with different words and terms. So here's that example. We're doing a post-coordinate search here where we're searching children and art. This is a keyword search. So again, notice that it brings you back the results list. That's resources directly. There's no intermediate step where it is listing those subject headings out because you have multiple subject headings in your search, right? Which one would it show you? It would show you children or would it show you art? When you're combining them together, it can't do that. It has to just take you to the resources themselves. Let's move on to talking about open versus closed vocabularies. This is a little bit easier than the difference between pre-coordinate and post-coordinate. An open vocabulary is simply one where an indexer, someone who's using the vocabulary to describe resources, is free to add new terms to the vocabulary. So if you've done your subject analysis and you've thought of a concept for this resource and you look at the control vocabulary and there's not a term that really encapsulates that idea, in an open vocabulary you can add one as the indexer. Closed vocabulary, only the designers of the CV can add new terms. So that means if you are, performing your subject analysis on a particular book in your library and there's not a term in the vocabulary that covers it, you can't just add something in there. You have to contact the designers of the CV and have them add it in for you. This decision is one that really needs to be made when you're creating the vocabulary. How are you going to treat new terms? Are you going to let anybody, any indexer, any cataloger, add a new term? Or are you going to make them contact you or the organization that you're working with to add a new term? So you want to decide that early on. It's not a decision you want to be making down the line. Finally, we're going to talk about enumeration and synthesis. And this is about how a vocabulary is set up to operate. And this means sort of where and at what point the creation of terms actually happens. Does it happen with the CV creators? I know this sounds a little counterintuitive, but just hang on for a second. Is it the CV creators create and list out every specific term you can use? Or do the CV creators come up with a list of terms from which indexers can then create more specific terms. We'll talk about some examples. Let's talk about enumeration first. So enumeration, it doesn't mean they have numbers, it just means things are listed out. So an enumerated vocabulary is a list of terms. The indexing process is fairly straightforward, right? You've done your subject analysis, you've come up with an idea of what this work is about, you look at the list of terms, you select a term that represents that idea, and you apply that term to your resource. So you add it to the bibliographic record or the database or whatever system you're working with. If a term is not present, right, this is usually a closed vocabulary. The indexer has to contact the CV designer to add a term, or they're out of luck. So here's a short example of an enumerated vocabulary. And this is a vocabulary in the domain of, let's say, housewares. We have it listed out. There's a term for bowls, term chairs, the term plastic bowls, term steel bookshelves, steel chairs, wood bookshelves, wood bowls, and wood chairs. This is pretty easy if we have this that we're trying to describe, right? Plastic bowls, that's the term that we would apply, it's in our list. How about this one? Wood bowls, it's in our list. How about this one? Okay, wood chairs, it's in our list. What about this? There is no term in our list for plastic chairs. There's nothing we can do. The best we can do is to add the term chairs and use that as a label. It's not as specific as we would like, or we can contact the designers of the CV and say, hey, there's a new surge in plastic chairs, we need that added to our vocabulary. And they may or may not support that. Advantages and disadvantages to enumerated vocabularies, right? Advantages, it's pretty easy to use. There are a lot fewer rules for indexers. You just look up your term, you record it, and you move on with your day. All the possible terms appear in the vocabulary, so it's easy to search and display all the possible terms. Disadvantages, like we just saw, if you need a term, it might not be available. Think of our plastic chairs. That combination just wasn't there. Your list can become really long. So again, going back to that idea of bloat, because terms might have to be repeated over and over and over and over and over. If we have material and we have, an object type, we need wood bowls, wood chairs, wood bookshelves, wood cabinets, wood structures. We need plastic bowls, plastic chairs, plastic bookshelves, plastic cabinets, plastic structures, so on and so forth. So our list becomes very, very long to cover everything we need. Synthetic vocabulary is different from an enumerated vocabulary. What a synthetic vocabulary does is it provides what we call tables, which are individual lists of terms, and then rules for combining those terms to form new indexing terms. So in this type of process, you look at your resource, you do your subject analysis, you look at the multiple lists, you usually select a term from each list. Then as the indexer, you combine those terms in a specific order that's been prescribed by these rules, and then you record that combined term in your bibliographic record or your database or however else you are representing your resources. These tables that include lists of terms are often based on what we call facets. So facet is a particular category or type of term, and the typical examples are like geographic area. So you might have a list of all 50 states. Time period, you might have a list of centuries. Media, like in art, so you might have a list of something like, painting, photography, video, and so on and so forth. So what's really important is that these tables are exclusive to one another, that you don't have concepts that overlap, so you don't have some media in one table and some media in another table. What we call rules of syntax are what tells the indexer how these terms can be combined. Usually it's about order. So if you're choosing sort of one term from each table, there might be a rule that says the geographic table comes first, and then the time period, and then the media, and not the other way around. So synthetic systems are open in a sense because indexers are creating new terms all the time, but you're creating them based on those lists. So if as an indexer, if there's, I have my geographic list and it's 50 states, but I encounter a resource about Puerto Rico and I can't add that, then it's still a closed vocabulary. So if I can't add a new term to a table or a whole new table, it's still considered closed in that sense. So here's, going back to our household goods example, here's an example of what a synthetic vocabulary might look at. So we have two tables here. Table 1 is for type of object, and in that table we have the term bookshelves, bowls, and chairs. And in table 2 we have type of material, and we have the terms plastic, steel, and wood. So we might be given a syntax rule where it says combine a material term from table 2 with a type of object term from table 1. So if we are trying to describe our chairs from earlier, we can say, oh, table 1, the correct term would be chairs. Table 2, the correct appropriate description would be plastic. I need to follow the rule. The term from table 2 comes first, and the type of object from table 1 comes second. So I would create the term plastic chairs and record that in my bibliographic record or other database entry. Like all the other types, there are advantages and disadvantages. So one really strong advantage is that all combinations are possible. As long as there's a term in the tables and the rules allow it, you can have a lot of flexibility. You also save a lot of space. There's a very short vocabulary. You don't have to list out every possible combination. You only need those table-based lists and a set of rules. One major disadvantage, though, is it's difficult to display the entire CV for a user to navigate and get a sense of the domain. If there's a whole list of all of the topics that a user can browse or scroll through, it can give them a really good sense of what's available. Displaying these tables and these rules to users, it's really hard for people to parse. The other thing is for indexers, if you're looking for a specific term, you can't search for a combination. You can only search for terms within those tables. So it can be hard sometimes to find a concept or a term representing a concept that you want to apply. The other major disadvantage is that cross-references are problematic. So you can't have a reference like synthetic chairs, see plastic chairs, for example, because neither of those terms are pre-constructed in the vocabulary. None of them are listed out in that form. You only have chairs. So I want to emphasize that, again, this is not one or the other. Most CVs will have some enumeration and some synthesis possibilities in them. The Library of Congress subject headings is a good example. It's mostly an enumerated vocabulary. Most terms for topics are listed out, but it does allow a little bit of synthesis in specific areas. So it's where it really emphasizes synthesis is in like topics and approaches, forms of works like fiction, dictionaries, periodicals, chronology, so time periods, and geography, places. And those are really the main areas of synthesis in LCSH. So it's more like a spectrum or a continuum, again, where a vocabulary might be more enumerated and less synthetic, or might be more synthetic and less enumerated, but there's going to be some of each in any particular vocabulary. So I know sometimes students get a little bit confused between the concepts of synthesis and enumeration versus the concepts of pre and post coordination. So I want to take just a minute to try to untangle some of that. So on our spectrum, some enumerated vocabularies can be pre-coordinate and others can be post-coordinate. Really, an enumerated vocabulary, right, is a list, and you can just as easily have a list of pre-coordinate terms with multiple concepts embedded in them, as you can have a list of post-coordinate terms, each term representing a single concept. So you can have a list either way. A lot of synthetic vocabularies are pre-coordinate, where they have multiple concepts in each term in a table, but it's also very possible for a synthetic vocabulary to be post-coordinate, where each term in a table represents a single concept. This one really varies depending on the vocabulary. If you're confused about the idea of open and closed, right, we talked a little bit about how all synthetic vocabularies are open to a limited extent, in that the indexer or cataloger is creating a new term every time they're applying a term to a resource. But again, it could be closed if in fact a cataloger or indexer cannot add new terms to the tables or add new tables to the vocabulary. And then there's this question of whether or not we could have a completely open synthetic system where a cataloger or indexer could add anything at any time. How would that affect the tables? If you are adding a new table, if you as the cataloger or indexer have the flexibility to add a new table, how does that affect the rules for that vocabulary? And if that vocabulary is being shared with other institutions where they're using, there's 4 tables and you create an additional table making 5 and you add new rules, how do you communicate that and make that interoperable with other institutions that might be using the same vocabulary? So that's just something to think about. I don't think that's a problem that we're going to solve today or in this class, but a couple things that might help you tease these ideas apart from one another. So that covers our beginning steps to creating a controlled vocabulary, deciding what kind of vocabulary we're going to have and what are the qualities of our vocabulary. Coming up in the next lecture, we're going to talk more specifically about how do we actually choose terms, how do we control those terms, and how do we build relationships among those terms. In the meantime, as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.